Hello again, and welcome back to Year 4 of the Religious Education Initiative. This is Week 19, Day 1. We began this year of the REI back in September reading about the patriarchs Isaac and Jacob and how they received the promises of the Lord, the covenant that God had made with Abraham, renewed with each of them in turn. After that, we read the story of Gideon the judge and saw how the people of God had fallen from the faithfulness to which they were called. We saw in our reading from the book of Ruth the first hint of the remedy for that faithlessness with the great-grandparents of David the king, from whose line the Messiah, the anointed one of God, would be born to make all things right. Next week we will begin to read the story of King David, but first we will read a summary of God's dealings with his people from the time of the Exodus, from Egypt until David's time. This is one of the longer psalms, so it's not a short reading, but it is beautiful in its summation of this reality from the time of the Exodus forward. So, this is Psalm 77 in the 77 or 78 in the Septuagint or the Masoretic numbering. It's also the first psalm of the 11th Kathisma, and it reads, "Give ear, O my people, to my law. Incline your ears to the words of my mouth. I will open my mouth in parables. I will utter riddles from of old, which we have heard and known, and our fathers have told us. They were not concealed from their children in the coming generation, but they recounted the praises of the Lord and his mighty works and the wonders that he did. And he established a testimony in Jacob and appointed a law in Israel, which he commanded our fathers to make known to their children, that the coming generation might know them, the children yet unborn, who should arise and tell them to their children, that they might set their hope in God and not forget God's works, but search his commandments, that they might not be like their fathers, a crooked and rebellious generation, a generation that did not make their heart right, and whose spirit was not faithful with God. The children of Ephraim, when they bent their bows and shot, were turned back in the day of battle. They did not keep the covenant of God and would not walk in his law. And they forgot his benefactions and his wonders that he had shown them, the wonders he had done in the sight of their fathers, in the land of Egypt, in the plain of Tanis. He cleaved the sea and brought them through. He made the waters stand as in a wineskin. And he led them with a cloud by day and with a light of fire all the night. He cleaved the rock in the wilderness and gave them drink as from the great deep. And he brought forth water out of the rock and made waters run down like rivers. And they sinned yet more against him. They provoked the Most High in a waterless place. And they tested God in their hearts by asking food for their appetite. And they spoke against God and said, Can God provide a table in the wilderness? Behold, he struck the rock, and the waters gushed out, and the streams overflowed. Can he also give bread? Can he provide a table for his people? Therefore the Lord heard this and was enraged, and a fire was kindled against Jacob, and anger rose up against Israel, because they did not have faith in God, nor did they trust in his salvation. Though he had commanded the clouds from above, and opened the doors of heaven, and had rained down manna upon them to eat, and had given them the bread of heaven. Man ate the bread of angels. He sent them provisions to the full. He removed the south wind from heaven, and by his power he brought in the west wind. And he rained down meat upon them like dust, and winged birds like the sand of the seas. And they fell into the midst of their camp, all around their tents. So they ate and were abundantly filled. And he gave them their own desire. They were not deprived of their desire. While the food was still in their mouths, then did the wrath of God rise up against them. And he slew the stoutest of them, and fettered the chosen men of Israel. For this they sinned still, and did not have faith in his wondrous works. And their days were consumed in vanity, and their years with haste. When he slew them, they sought him, and they repented, and came early to God. And they remembered that God was their helper, and the Most High their Redeemer. And they loved him with their mouth, but lied to him with their tongue. And their heart was not right with him, nor were they faithful to his covenant. Yet he is compassionate, and forgives their sins, and will not destroy them. And many a time will he turn away his anger, and will not kindle all his wrath. And he remembered that they were flesh, a spirit that passes, and does not come again. How often they provoked him in the wilderness, and angered him in a waterless land. And they turned about, and put God to the test, and embittered the Holy One of Israel. And they did not remember his hand, nor the day when he redeemed them from the hand of the oppressor, how he had wrought his signs in Egypt, and his portents in the plain of Tanis. And he turned their rivers into blood, and their pools so that they could not drink. He sent among them dog flies which devoured them, and frogs which destroyed them. And he gave their crop to the blight, and their labor to the locust. He killed their vines with hail, and their mulberry trees with frost. He delivered their cattle also to the hail, and their substance to the fire. He sent among them the fierceness of his anger, wrath and indignation, and affliction, a mission performed by evil angels. He made a path for his anger, and did not spare their souls from death, and their cattle he consigned to death. And he smote every firstborn in the land of Egypt, the firstfruits of all their labor in the dwellings of Ham. And he removed his people like sheep, and guided them in the wilderness like a flock. And he led them forth in hope, and they were not afraid, but the sea covered their enemies. And he brought them to the border of his sanctuary, this mountain which his right hand had purchased. And he cast out the nations before their face, and divided to them an inheritance by line, and settled the tribes of Israel in their dwellings. And they tested and provoked the Most High God, and did not observe his testimonies. And they turned away, and broke faith like their fathers. They twisted like a crooked bow. And they provoked him to anger with their hills, and moved him to jealousy with their graven images. When God heard this, he was furious, and he greatly abhorred Israel. And he rejected the tabernacle at Shiloh, the tent where he dwelt among men. And he delivered their strength into captivity, and their beauty into the hands of their enemies. And he consigned his people to the sword, and was furious with his inheritance. Fire consumed their young men, and their virgins were not mourned. Their priests fell by the sword, and there was none to weep for their widows. And the Lord awoke as one who sleeps, like a mighty man grown hot from wine. And he struck his enemies on the backside. He put them to a perpetual reproach. And he rejected the dwelling of Joseph, and did not choose the tribe of Ephraim. And he chose the tribe of Judah, Mount Zion, which he loved. And he built his sanctuary like that of a unicorn. He established it in the land forever. And he chose David his servant, and took him from the sheepfolds. He brought him from following the ewes great with young, to shepherd Jacob his servant, and Israel his inheritance. And he shepherded them in the integrity of his heart, and guided them by the skillfulness of his hands. So this is not a particularly happy or encouraging psalm, because the psalmist, is reflecting on the entire history of God's people, and a great deal of that history is precisely of faithlessness and exile, and the removal of God's protection, so that evil things come upon those who have been faithless. We could talk about this for a long time and go through everything that is described. Maybe we will just go through first. This is clearly written at the time of David. He's reflecting on this reality of God's people in the promised land. He says he's going to go back and talk about everything in the past. He says God made a covenant with Jacob and appointed a law in Israel, and he told us to teach our children so that the children would not be faithless and perverse and crooked and rebellious like their forefathers were. And then he goes back a little bit, saying the children of Ephraim bent their bows and shot, and then they left. They abandoned the battle. They did not keep God's covenant. They would not walk in his law. Ephraim is being taken to task because they were the leading tribe, even coming out of Egypt. They were the leading tribe. The tabernacle was set at Shiloh, which was in, I believe, the territory of Ephraim. So they had been the leaders of the people, and yet they don't remain so. So then we're going to do the retrospective. He's talking about the time of the judges first, and then says, but let's go back and look at what happened. Our forefathers, they were in the wilderness. They had seen the work that God did. He led them by a cloud. He gave them all these things, but they sinned. They doubted him. They questioned him. They blamed him. So God was enraged against them. He gave them food. He gave them their heart's desire, and they did not withhold themselves from their heart's desire, and therefore it made them sick and brought a plague on them until God was merciful on them. And they repented. Well, when they repented, then God was merciful on them. But their repentance wasn't real, he says. They repented with their mouths, but their heart was not turned towards him. But he's still compassionate, and he remembers that they are flesh. And then he kind of goes again, but now another layer, another generation back. They provoked him in the wilderness, and they didn't remember what he had done to those who were first faithless to him, to the Egyptians who had enslaved them. And then he recounts all the plagues by which God delivered his people out of Egypt and brought them out into the wilderness and brought them to the mountain and made them his own inheritance. And then he comes back to the present, to the time of the judges, how they provoked and tested the Most High God, how they did exactly what their fathers did. They broke faith and they provoked him. They worshipped other gods in other places. They made graven images instead of being faithful to God. And therefore God rejected his tabernacle at Shiloh. He rejected Ephraim. He gave his people into captivity, but he did not forsake them. In this passage where he rejects Shiloh, he gives their strength, their beauty into the hands of the enemies. Fire consumed the young men, their virgins were not mourned, their priests fell by the sword. This is all speaking of what we see happening in the first chapters of 1 Samuel, when Eli is the priest at Shiloh, and Samuel is becoming the prophet, but is not yet. And the tabernacle is brought to battle as a totem of victory and is captured by the Philistines, and the priests are struck down dead. And the people finally learn to repent. God awakes like one who sleeps, and he drives out his enemies. He rejects the tribe of Joseph and the tribe of Ephraim, and he chooses the tribe of Judah. He raises up a king. Of course, we're kind of skipping over what happens with Saul. David doesn't speak ill of Saul. Even in the Psalms, he doesn't speak ill of Saul, but he speaks of how God has now raised up the tribe of Judah, raised up David to shepherd his people. Now, this is a beautiful thing to read as we're seeing the Messiah, the descendant of David, as it were, or rather the reality of whom David is only a foreshadowing, standing up now in the temple on Mount Zion, proclaiming now living water, proclaiming that he is the bread from heaven. All of this goes along very nicely with what we see happening in fulfillment in the Gospel of John. But for now, it's a nice prelude to our reading of the first half, at least, of the story of King David, which we'll pick up starting next week. So that's it for today. God bless you all. We'll see you again for day 2.